Hello and welcome to today's module, Optimizing Learning and Motivation. In this module, we'll discuss theories and strategies for improving learning and motivation. The sources of the material held in this module come out of our required textbook of Wade Gilbert, Coaching Better Every Season, and also out of our Weinberg and Gold, Foundation of Sport and Exercise Psychology 7th edition. The learning objectives for this module is that we'll be able to define pedagogy and identify a strategy to improve our pedagogy. Describe the self-fulfilling prophecy, self-determination theory, and learned helplessness. We should be able to identify and discuss Fitts and Posner's stages of learning, as well as be able to discuss evidence-based strategies to optimize learning and motivation. Before we even begin teaching, we need to make sure that we create a positive learning environment. This stems from providing an environment where respect, value, and trust are developed. Along with those qualities, it needs to be inclusive, not just a diverse group, but it needs to be inclusive, meaning that you actively engage in incorporating everybody within the learning process. We need to make sure it's fun, educational, and engaging. When we look at improving motivation in learning, we need to be able to understand the individual. It's very helpful to know what pedagogy is. It's important to incorporate pedagogical practices and strategies. It's also useful to know what the self-fulfilling prophecy is and learned helplessness in order for us to reshape behavior and help in the learning process. Additionally, being able to motivate athletes both intrinsically and extrinsically with the proper feedback and reinforcement is critical to improving learning amongst our team. By understanding Fitts and Posner's stages of learning, we're going to be able to design effective practices. And lastly, being able to understand evidence-based strategies that will help improve learning and motivation will allow us to reap the benefits of providing a positive learning environment. It's important that we understand the athlete as an individual. By understanding their prior knowledge and experience within the sport, their particular motivation to participate, and their ability and skill mastery will help us tailor our teachings to each individual to improve their learning. In addition to understanding our athletes as individuals, it's important that we understand what pedagogy is and how to improve our own pedagogy in our effort to improve the learning of our athletes. What is pedagogy? Well, essentially, pedagogy is the art and science of teaching. It requires a knowledge of learning processes and the ability to use strategies to optimize learning. There are several models we can review to improve our pedagogy, but in today's module, let's review the 15 P's of improving pedagogy. The first P is plan. We need to make sure we have a strategy in place to help our athletes improve their learning and motivation. Next, we need to prepare the learner and the environment to make sure that we provide the optimal resources for them to learn. Next, we need to be able to present efficiently, both verbally and non-verbally. We need to be able to discuss what we want them to do, demonstrate what they want to do, and then repeat time and time again to make sure that they understand what it is that they need to learn and how to learn it. It's really helpful to have a pretest to make sure we understand where our learner is at the current moment, and then we can test them later to see the progress that they've made. But having a pretest helps us set the foundation for where they are at the beginning part of the learning process. When we design practices, we must design them to be purposeful, playful, progressive, paced, and personalized. This is important because when we design practices that are not purposeful, they lose their meaning and athletes lose engagement. Additionally, we need to be able to provide feedback and make sure that we praise the effort more than anything, more than the results. We need to make sure we praise effort with motivational and instructional feedback. Lastly, as a coach, as a teacher, we need to project poise, patience, and a passion for the material and sport we are coaching. John Wooden stated that if your athletes are not learning, you are not teaching. Teaching is at the heart of pedagogy. When teaching and trying to improve learning, it's also important to understand what drives motivation to learn. There are three key factors that drive our motivation. They are subjective value, beliefs and expectations, and a value source. Within the subjective value, this really goes back to how does the participant view the goal importance? In order to make sure that they understand how important the goal is, it's important that we clearly explain why goals and practice are important in the learning process. Next, with beliefs and expectations, this is back on the learner. This is where the learner has beliefs and expectations of their own ability to learn. And this is derived from their skill mastery or lack thereof. And the value source that is discussed is part of the driving factors behind motivation to learn. Well, they are the attainment value, intrinsic value, and instrumental value. More plainly put, personal satisfaction to attaining a goal, the intrinsic motivation to attain that goal, and the extrinsic motivation to attain that goal. So by understanding the subjective value, beliefs and expectancies of the learner, and the value source that the learner is placing on what is being taught, we can understand more of their motivation and help drive them to optimize their learning. In an effort to optimize learning and drive motivation to learn, it's important to understand how our beliefs and expectancies are shaped. One way to look at this is through the self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's take, for instance, you have very high beliefs in yourself. You have great self-efficacy. When you have high self-efficacy, you have high expectations of success. That'll drive your behavior in a way where you will put in a lot of effort, you'll maintain a better attitude throughout the challenges that you'll face, and you'll face those challenges with more resilience, leading to better results, therefore reinforcing your belief in your ability to perform the task at hand. Now let's take the opposite. If you have low self-efficacy, so low belief in yourself, now you have low expectations of success. Because you have low expectations of success, that will drive negative behavior, meaning that you won't put in as much effort. You won't be as resilient during adverse times. And then your results will be what they are, and they're usually much lower than if you had high self-esteem or high self-efficacy. And those results that you attain then reinforce your belief that you just weren't good enough to begin with. And it's important that we understand this because we as coaches have the ability to reshape those beliefs. Now, we're not necessarily going to reshape those beliefs overnight. It's going to take time. And it's taking that time to develop goals, and especially process and performance goals, that will raise that self-efficacy of an individual. By raising that self-efficacy and that belief in self, that'll raise their expectations of success, motivate that behavior to be more positive, have higher effort, greater persistence through adversity. That way those results begin to change in a positive way, therefore reinforcing the beliefs that I can learn, that I can be better. And that's an important part of shaping the beliefs and expectancies of our athletes. It's important that we understand how to reshape beliefs and expectancies, because when kids fail and receive negative feedback, they often give up because they feel that learning the skill or completing the task just seems too difficult. Now, this is a negative consequence of mismanaged feedback and reinforcement, and can lead to what we know as learned helplessness. Now, learned helplessness is the feeling of apathy that no matter how much effort you put into something, the results will never be what you want. And that this attitude is acquired when we perceive, again, that our actions and our effort have no effect on the desired outcome. It's important to remember that this is not a personality flaw, but rather it's a result of our goal orientation. Oftentimes we become apathetic to learning when we have an outcome goal orientation as opposed to task mastery goal orientation. We end up with maladaptive achievement tendencies such as fear of failure and avoidance of tasks that seem too difficult, along with just negative experiences. Our negative experiences lead to a low perceived ability, and all these factors affect our learning. So how do we correct it? Well, it requires individual attention. It requires changing from an outcome goal orientation into more task mastery and performance goal orientation. Also, that when we have little successes, that we receive the appropriate feedback and reinforcement. Now, the biggest obstacle typically to helping somebody with learned helplessness is that it takes a lot of time and hard work on both the learner's part and the teacher's part in order to change the direction and intensity of somebody's motivation. Because someone who has a case of learned helplessness really ends up feeling that they have a low perceived perception of control and low perceived ability, both of which affects their desire to learn. So how do we change that motivation to learn? Well, as we mentioned earlier, one of the value sources is that intrinsic value or that intrinsic motivation. And when we talk about intrinsic motivation, what we're really discussing are the three primary factors, the fundamental factors that drive all our behavior. And this has been studied throughout the ages of research in psychology, and they've come up with three fundamental factors that drive what we know as self-determined behavior. That is autonomy, belonging, and competence. Autonomy really relates to the idea of choice, that as an individual, I want to have a choice in what I do. By giving individuals choice, you help develop autonomy, in a sense, developing intrinsic motivation. Also, that feeling of belonging or relatedness to a group, that is a driving factor in developing intrinsic motivation, which will in turn optimize learning. And lastly, building of competence. As we mentioned in the self-fulfilling prophecy, one of the keys to improving that belief and expectancies is to develop competence in a skill and develop skill mastery. That comes from setting many goals and achieving little goals and several little goals to build that competence. But if we develop autonomy, belonging, and competence, we will develop empowered individuals. So how do you know if you're empowered? Well, ask yourself these three questions. Can I do it? Will it work? And is it worth it? Now, the can I do it question relates to Albert Bandura's self-efficacy, and self-efficacy directly relates to competence, right? So if you say yes, then you feel self-competent. When you look at the will it work question, that also relates to another Albert Bandura theory, which is the response efficacy. Will the plan work? Will the goals I set work? You know, this goes back to the subjective value and why is that goal important? If we can clearly explain why that goal is important and the individual can understand that, okay, the plan will work, the goal will work to help me get to my outcome that I'm looking for, then they answer yes to that question. And is it worth it? Are the consequences worth it? Are all the sacrifices, all the effort, all the challenges you're going to face worth achieving the goal and improving learning? If you answer yes to all three questions, you know you're empowered and you will feel intrinsically motivated. If you answer no to any one of those questions, well, now as a teacher, as a coach, I can then figure out, okay, is it the self-efficacy question? Is it the response efficacy question? Or is it the consequences question that I need to help them answer yes to? And then I can develop a strategy and a game plan to help them improve their intrinsic motivation and feel empowered. So in addition to subjective value, beliefs and expectancies, and the value source, what are some other factors affecting learning and motivation? We can categorize two other subgroups, social factors and psychological factors. Within the social factors, we look at the successes and failures and how those successes and failures develop their competence or lack thereof. We also look at the competitive focus. Are we more competitive with ourselves and trying to improve ourselves, become 1% better every day? Or are we more worried about the outcome and we're more focused on the competitive results with our opponent? Also, coaches' behavior. How we give feedback and deliver reinforcement is critical to helping our athletes learn. Under the psychological factors, this really goes back to the development of self-determined behavior, going back to the ABCs, the autonomy, belonging, and competence. Also, how are our coping skills? Do we have good coping skills, bad coping skills, any coping skills at all, right? Also, our perceived ability, perceived control, and goal orientation are all other psychological factors that affect our learning and motivation. So in order to improve motivation and learning, we need to focus in on intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, with using the proper feedback. Again, with intrinsic motivation, developing self-determined behavior. With extrinsic motivation, that's where reinforcement of desired behaviors really comes into play. And it's important to understand that it's that feedback of instructional and motivational feedback that is critical, especially when we praise effort over results, will be a critical factor in our improving our motivation and learning, as well as being able to know when we're supposed to give feedback, how often, what's our frequency, what's the timing of that feedback. And we'll discuss some of those strategies as we move along in this module. Now, there are many models and strategies to optimize motor skill development and learning. The one we'll focus in on this module is Fitts and Posner's stages of learning. Essentially, they have described 3 stages of learning: cognitive, associative, and autonomous. Let's take a look at what each of these stages incorporate and how we can apply that to designing a practice. Now, in the first stage, the cognitive stage, this is where we begin to understand what is necessary to perform the skill correctly, and we actually do most of our learning at this stage. Now, things to consider as the instructor or coach or teacher in this realm is that the learner is going to make a lot of errors. So there's frequent errors, and there's a high attentional demand to thoughts and actions. Things aren't fluid. Motions and movements aren't coordinated necessarily right here. And it's important that at this time that we work more on form and technique and perform the activity slowly. And during this time, we need to provide lots of feedback, both verbal, nonverbal, instructional, motivational, and the frequency of this is often. We need to cue and give feedback often to make sure that the behaviors can be corrected right away, as opposed to waiting till they make too many mistakes and get the wrong muscle memory developed. So the implications for practice during this stage are that we have to demonstrate the skill, both visually and mentally picture the skills. So this is where we can spend time with our athletes, and we have to actually manually manipulate their body at times, but we also want to have them spend time where they use some imagery. Right now in this phase is definitely a time when we have to work on the fundamentals of the movement, and we have to re-demonstrate those fundamentals regularly until they develop muscle memory for performing the movements correctly. And as mentioned earlier, during this time, we have to give lots of short cues and frequent feedback. In the associative stage, this is when the motor skill and muscle memory begin to develop, and we can begin to refine those movements with practice. We'll notice that there's an improved accuracy and consistency of motor skills, there's a reduction in errors, and there's an improved success and fluency of the movement and or desired outcomes. And then this is where the learner can then intrinsically and kinesthetically give themselves feedback. Now, this is an important part of the learning process because this is when the individual begins to learn how to problem solve and correct their mistakes. So what are some implications for practice during this phase? Well, now we can begin to use more complex and detailed cues, more complex drills. We can differ the practice situation and introduce the competitive setting. Notice this is when we can introduce the competitive setting, that we don't necessarily want to introduce the competitive setting during the cognitive stage because there's too much going on with us having to think about the movements and think about how we're going to do something, and it makes it really difficult to actually compete against somebody else. So it's the associative stage where we should begin to introduce competitive settings. And at this point now, we can begin to give fewer cues, and they become intermittent, not as frequent as when they're in the cognitive stage. The final stage in Fitts and Posner's stages of learning is the autonomous stage. Now, the autonomous stage is when movements and coordinated movements become automatic, essentially, where you don't have to think about it. You can spend your cognition and your thoughts on the strategies and on the cues that you're taking in from your environment. So you're better equipped at this point to be able to be highly competitive. What this means for practice is that you can really start to refine your skills. You may have to go back to correcting some fundamental mistakes that maybe you got into bad habits because you were experiencing a lot of success over the course of the learning process and you've developed some bad habits, but now you can go back and refine those bad habits and make them more fundamental skills again. You can incorporate the mental skills during the events such as routines, mental imagery, arousal regulation, and even in competition goal setting. So that way you can focus in on those things because now you're not thinking about how to move or what you have to do something successfully. Now you're just doing it automatically. We want to now focus in on tactical strategies for improving performance. And now is a time that we give, as coaches, very few cues and limited feedback. We use this time in the learning process to allow the athlete to really self-analyze the movement and make their own adjustments based on what they're feeling kinesthetically. Now let's take a look at a few strategies that we can incorporate to optimize learning and motivation as well. Now, you may want to refer to the supplemental article, 11 Optimal Learning Environments, that is also included in the content section on Beachboard. But essentially, it's important that as a coach and as a teacher that we learn not to be threatened, that we need to be open. Athletes are going to ask lots of questions, and we need to encourage these ideas. We need to provide opportunities for learning. We need to help our athletes become students of the sport and tailor our instructions to the individual. Now, when designing practice, we need to have pragmatic practices. We need to have a balance between drills and competitive practices. We need to keep long and short-term objectives and goals in mind. With our coaching methods, well, we have to use multiple strategies. One size does not fit all. And it's important that within our methods that we measure performance along the way, that we have pre-tests, mid-tests, and post-tests to gauge our progress, especially when we've set goals to help build competence. And lastly, a key strategy that we need to implement is that we need structured feedback. We need a reward and reinforcement system so we can recreate the desired behaviors and attitudes that we want and help our athletes learn better. Now, it's important that we understand the factors affecting motivation and learning, the psychology behind our self-fulfilling prophecy, and the psychology behind intrinsic motivation, as well as understanding stages of learning such as the one presented by Fitz and Posner, because what we really are after are to reap the benefits of a positive learning environment. Those benefits include increased motivation, increased participation in learning, increased acceptance of others in creating a positive learning environment and inclusive environment, which will enhance learning, decrease the dropout rate, and decrease that feeling of social inclusion. Again, if we take a look at all these and we wrap it up into one small little package, and if we can just remember the ABCs of intrinsic motivation, incorporate strategies to improve learning, we will do a great job of helping and optimizing the learning and motivation for our athletes.